This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the War Powers Act and the executive branch. What I want to do in this particular PowerPoint is talk about the long range that we've been talking about in class, about how the executive has taken on more and more power over time when it comes to war making, and whether or not this is a good idea for the Constitution. It may very well be that it is. So we're going to go back and we're going to review some issues that we've talked about the origins of war-making power within the United States as far as the Constitution goes, and then what's been the precedent or tradition that's allowed the executive branch to take over more power, and then we're going to try and update that and bring that up to modern times and kind of take a look at what's happening with the executive branch as far as the Middle East goes. So first off, you probably remember we talked about in class that when it came to the Constitution and war-making power, the founders were very fearful about giving too much power for the executive. Now, when we look at the context, because we always want to be careful of context here, it's kind of obvious why they were fearful of this. They were fearful of this because of their tradition of dealing with the English monarch and the ability for the English monarch to use the military to force his will upon the people. So because of that, the founders made sure that the legislative branch was going to be the sole branch that would be able to declare war. Now, why the legislative branch? Well, by putting in the legislative branch, it made war-making powers very limited. In order to get people to agree to go to war, you would have to have all the legislatures agree to this, or at least a majority of them agree to this. And this is much more difficult than just having one individual do this. So the idea behind it was really to provide as many checks and balances, especially for war-making power, because according to the founders, this was the ultimate power that the government could have. They also provided the legislative branch with the ability to fund or defund wars. Now, this is actually a very huge power to be able to give to a branch of government. If the president, for whatever reason, is managing the war and the legislative branch at some point decides that it's going to stop funding the war, that in essence destroys the ability for the war to take place. So as we can see here, the Founding Fathers seemed to give a lot of power to the Congress when it came to dealing with the issue of war-making powers. Probably the group that was most staunch behind this was Democratic Republicans. Both Federalists and Democratic Republicans both feared the kind of monarchical power that they saw in England, but it was really the Democratic Republicans that feared it the most. And if they had had their way, probably would have just had a completely voluntary state militia system in which militias would just be drawn up in the states and there would be no federal military power. But in the long run, because of the historical circumstances of dealing with France and the Quasi-War and dealing with internal rebellions like the Shays Rebellions or the Whiskey Rebellion, the Democratic Republicans gave in to the fact that there needed to be some kind of national army, but that national army would be voluntary, and the executive branch would have to get the legislature to agree to go to war, and by doing this, they hoped to create checks and balances. Now, what's happened is, over time, is that there's been a constitutional tradition that's arisen. So it's very important to understand this. This is not in the Constitution. This is a tradition that's been considered to be constitutional based upon the idea that the president should have what are called emergency powers. Well, where does this come from in the Constitution? Well, the Constitution does make the executive branch into the commander-in-chief, and during a wartime situation, the president is given a lot of deference in order to manage the war. Out of this, there's been a precedent that's arisen that the president needs to have some flexibility during time periods in order to deal with emergency situations. So what's really important to understand here is that this is considered to be constitutional, but not because it's literally in the Constitution, but rather it's implied, and there's been a system of precedence or tradition that gives him this power. So originally, leadership after the war, this type of idea was that the leadership would be given after the war was declared. So the legislative branch has to declare the war. Once that happens, the president then can manage the war. However, what's happened is that presidents have claimed that there needs to be emergency powers to respond to national security issues around the world. An example, at the beginning of the country when Thomas Jefferson became president, there was a problem off of the northwestern coast of Africa that Europe had been dealing with, the United States had been dealing with, which was the Barbary pirates. The Barbary pirates were pirates who had aligned themselves with some of the North African kingdoms, especially the Ottoman Empire, in which if a European or American ship came into that area, the Barbary pirates would stop the ship and demand that they pay some kind of ransom or pay some kind of money, and then the Barbary pirates would split this between themselves and the Ottoman Empire, so they were protected by doing this. Thomas Jefferson went around Congress at the time. He did not get their declaration of war, and he used a new navy that he created in order to end the Barbary pirates and make sure that this could no no longer happen. This is a good example of the precedent set early on by Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, that the president needs to be able to respond to emergency situations around the world. Now, where we really see a grasping at power is Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. And a good example of that is when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. So habeas corpus means that the government has to give notice as to why you're brought in for imprisonment. The Constitution allows for that suspension in two cases: if there's a rebellion or if there's a foreign invasion. Now, you might be able to make the claim that there was a rebellion. In fact, Lincoln saw it this way. The South was in rebellion against the North. Definitely not a foreign invasion, considering that the North invaded into the South to try to bring them back into the Union. But here's really where the problem comes into play. The power to suspend is not given to the executive branch. It's given to the legislative branch in the first article. Now, here's the problem with this. Abraham Lincoln has established a tradition. The tradition was never challenged. The tradition was never taken to court and ended. And so because of that, there is a precedent that the executive is able to do something like this during a wartime situation. So now we go forward to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is going to assume a lot of power to the executive. Now, one interpretation of Woodrow Wilson is that he really didn't. First of all, the Congress declared war. Secondly, Woodrow Wilson passed most of his acts through the Congress. And most of the other things he did were on a voluntary basis. So you could make the argument that Woodrow Wilson really didn't do anything that was assuming executive power. But we have to keep in mind, again, not to interpret the Constitution just literally. Look at it in context. So far, we've seen that you can interpret the Constitution literally. There's also precedent. But there's a third issue, too, that comes up with Wilson, and that is the power of the office of the presidency. So when Woodrow Wilson, during a wartime situation, starts to work voluntarily with groups of people, the question is, how voluntary is it? Are you really going to tell the president during a time of war no to the things that he wants? So, like, for example, Wilson worked with Hollywood and created the Committee on Public Information to have George Creel go out and propagandize the war. Well, what if you as Hollywood were to say no to this effort? You're going to come across as being un-American. In 1917, the Selective Service Act placed a draft into effect. Now, we have precedent for this going back to the Civil War. Plus, on top of that, the war was a declared war. But at the same time, at this point, if you're going to conscientiously object to the war, what's the likelihood that you're going to look un-American? The best example of all this is the Sedition and Espionage Acts. So in this case, Wilson gets the Congress to pass, and this was passed by Congress, Sedition and Espionage Acts, that made it illegal to criticize the war effort. But take a look at an example of this. We have an example of Eugene Debs, who was a socialist who was imprisoned. He didn't come out and make lies about the war. He made interpretations about the war in which he claimed that the war was something he disagreed with. Now, this was upheld. In Schenck v. U.S., the Supreme Court held that if speech posed what they considered to be an imminent threat during a wartime situation, then people could be put in prison. But just imagine that, like, for today and some of the wars that we fought recently. What exactly is an imminent threat? Does that mean that if we do a protest against a war, like, for example, the Iraq War, or if you were protesting against some of President Obama's interventions, does that make it an imminent threat, or does that just mean that you are putting out opinions? Here we see Woodrow Wilson not so much assuming power only to the executive, but using the executive office in order to create a sense that if you disagree with the president, you are being un-American. Then we get into the Cold War context, and the Cold War context really amps up the power of the presidency. So this is where we see another element of what we consider to be constitutional or not constitutional. So far we talked about the literal Constitution, we've talked about precedent, we've talked about sort of the social pressures of the presidency. But here we have an example of the Cold War context and how the Cold War context, because the United States is becoming superpower in the world, really starts to give more and more power to the presidency to sort of manage U.S. leadership in the world. So the United States and USSR were fighting against each other, not directly, but in the Cold War, they fought what were known as proxy wars, in which we would fight through our allies in different parts of the world. We didn't want to fight directly with each other for fear of starting World War III. Truman at the time worked through the UN in order to start an emergency response to the North Korean invasion of South Korea. And then Eisenhower followed up with this by utilizing the CIA to topple governments in places like Iran, Guatemala, and the Congo. By the end of this, even Eisenhower warns that there's a problem here to be addressed. Now, Eisenhower's warning really had to do with what he called the military-industrial complex, in which the Pentagon, the Congress, and the presidency as a whole worked together and started to assume more and more power into the government. But notice what Eisenhower is saying here. Eisenhower, through his experience, notices that more and more power is being centralized into the government, and during the Cold War, a lot of it is being centralized into the executive branch, because in order to make sure we didn't get into a nuclear war, we ended up fighting through the CIA. Well, the CIA is within the executive branch, so we're really assuming more and more power into a very small group of people. This gets us very far away from that initial intention that the Founding Fathers had, that war-making power should be spread out, should be debated publicly, and that we should really only go to war in very limited circumstances so that we could limit the power of the government. The Vietnam War then becomes a huge turning point for us. And in order to understand why this is the case, we have to see how we got into the Vietnam War and why this became such a controversy for people. Because actually, originally for most people, there was a protest movement against the Vietnam War pretty much from its beginnings. But the Vietnam War held a popularity amongst the American public all the way up until the early 1970s. In fact, there was a poll done in which people went and knocked on people's doors in about 1965, and 70% of the people said that they were in favor of the Vietnam War as a way to stop communism. That same poll was done only 5 years later in 1970, and when they knocked on the door, 70% of people said we needed to get out of the Vietnam War. Well, what changed here? So the Vietnam War really starts back with Harry Truman. Truman began funding the South Vietnamese against the North Vietnamese communists, who were called the Viet Minh. The Eisenhower administration then raised that funding for the South Vietnamese. But it was John F. Kennedy who started to send in military advisors. So in the early 1960s, he sent people in just to advise those who were in South Vietnam in order to how to fight against the North Vietnamese communists. Then in 1964, Lyndon Johnson comes out and claims what is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Lyndon Johnson claims that two of our ships, the Seajoy Turner and Maddox, were attacked in international waters. And the claim was that we needed to fight back against this, because if we didn't, we might end up in what's called the domino theory, that if Vietnam falls to communism, then countries around it will also fall to communism. So by the end of the decade, Lyndon Johnson took what originally was probably about 50,000 military advisors and upped it all the way to 500,000 military combat troops inside of Vietnam. Now, in 1970 and 1973, there was a release of what are called the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg. Now, by this time, Lyndon Johnson was no longer the president. Richard Nixon was the president. Daniel Ellsberg leaked a group of papers called the Pentagon Papers on the Vietnam War. And it turns out that the attacks that took place in the Gulf of Tonkin were extremely questionable, especially the attack on the Seajoy Turner. So here's what actually happened. The first attack that took place against the Seajoy Turner was really an attack done by maybe one or two gunboats. Now, I know that sounds strange, but a gunboat for the Vietnamese was this very small boat. In fact, just to get a sense about how negligible this was, the captain of the American battleship heard some noise. He went out onto the deck of the ship, and he basically found the bullets that had been fired on the ship, lying on the ship. And that's all the attack was. Then there was a supposed second attack, and the second attack was on the Maddox. So the Maddox radioed to Washington, D.C. that they were under attack, and then a few hours later, they radioed again and said that actually they had misread their sonars, and that actually what had happened was there was a weather incident, and it made it look like they were being attacked when they really weren't. Yet Lyndon Johnson goes on TV and says that Seajoy Turner and Maddox were attacked, and they were attacked in international waters. Well, here's what even makes it more complicated. They were not in international waters. They were spying on the North Vietnamese. And then we get into the complexity even of the attack itself that happened in the case of the Seajoy Turner. So today we don't even know. Was that attack something that was done intentionally by the North Vietnamese commanders, or was this a rogue commander that went out and attacked the Seajoy Turner? Now, in the end, you might side with Lyndon Johnson and say any attack is an attack, period, and that we have to go to war over this. But is it really something that we're willing to risk 500,000 American military combat troops based upon a supposed weather incident and then a negligible attack on one of the battleships? Well, what we're seeing happening here is more and more of a centralization into one person making that decision amongst his advisors. And eventually, when the Pentagon Papers revealed this, that's what got Americans in the early 1970s to really question how much government oversight there was when it came to the war effort. So that led in the mid-1970s to what was called the Church Committee. And the Church Committee went back and researched all this. They wanted to find out, how much power had the executive branch taken, and was this really a good thing for us? Was this constitutional, and did it have good effects for us? And what the Church Committee found was not only what had happened in the Pentagon Papers, but all these CIA incidents that we've been talking about this year, in which the CIA went out and toppled governments around the world. In fact, they found another example of this in the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, Chile had replaced their leader with a man named Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende was an outright socialist. He argued the need to try and nationalize some of the businesses that were inside of Chile and to try to work with the unions there in order to better the living conditions for people. The American CIA actually worked with local unions in order to create a massive nationwide strike that took place, and the economy started to fail. And at that point, the military dictator, Pinochet, surrounded the palace of Salvador Allende, took him out of power, and after that, then Pinochet went out and did what was called a disappearance or killing of 100,000 people who disagreed with him within the country of Chile. And during that entire time period, the Nixon administration supported Pinochet. All of this happened under the guise of executive power seeking out national security. So with all of this happening, finally, the Church Committee, as well as the release of the Pentagon Papers, there was so much pressure at this point to deal with what was considered to be an executive power that had really gone out of control, that the Congress passed something called the War Powers Act. Now, the War Powers Act is not in the Constitution. It's something that was passed in order to deal with this issue of national emergency. What it does is it gives the president 60 days to complete an emergency action. At the end of those 60 days, they get a 30-day extension, if they would like, to go to the Congress and say that we need to consult with Congress and try to get the Congress's approval to go to war. If at the end of those 90 days you cannot get Congress's approval, then you have to call back all of the troops. Now, the critics at that time period who didn't like the War Powers Act claimed that this War Powers Act really was unconstitutional, that it limited the president's powers as commander-in-chief, that he needed to be able to have the flexibility to respond to national emergency situations. People who supported the War Powers Act made the argument that what we had seen happen with the Pentagon Papers and we saw happen with the Church Committee demonstrated that there needed to be limits on the president. Well, here's the interesting thing about it, whether you are a critic or a supporter of this. How many presidents have followed the War Powers Act since the time period that it's been passed? So that includes Jimmy Carter, President Ronald Reagan, the first President Bush, Clinton, second President Bush, and now President Obama. We'll see with President Trump is what he'll do. How many people have followed this? Zero. All the presidents since that time period have violated the War Powers Act, even though many of these presidents have claimed that they support the War Powers Act. So the War Powers Act has actually ended up being incredibly weak in its actual enforcement. And that leads us up to the War on Terror, because the War on Terror in so many ways has really made the War Powers Act almost inconsequential. So on 9/11, what ended up happening was there was a revelation by the end of 9/11. The real problem behind 9/11 was the different intelligence gathering services, the FBI, CIA, and so forth, were not sharing information. This actually gets back to the Church Committee. The Church Committee had originally established a firewall between the FBI and the CIA intentionally because of some of the problems that had happened during the 1960s and 1970s with the violation of people's rights. So the Patriot Act was passed in order to try to remove some of these walls between the FBI and the CIA. Also, President Bush passed he didn't pass, but he declared what's called the Bush Doctrine, which called for what's called the preemptive attacks on countries supportive of terrorism. So the idea behind this was that if a country was suspected of supporting terrorism, before they could attack us, we would attack them to try and undermine their abilities to support terrorism. And then finally, the Congress passed something called the Authorization of Military Force. The Authorization of Military Force handed over to the president an unlimited amount of power that the president could act whenever needed against al-Qaeda. So when you combine all these three things together, here's what happens with 9/11. Post 9/11, the executive branch has been given a massive amount of power. Basically, what the Patriot Act, the Bush Doctrine, and the Authorization of Military Force says is that whole War Powers Act, that may be on paper, but that is basically out the window. Because as long as a president can claim that there's any connection between their military action and stopping terrorism, a president can pretty much justify going out and using as much emergency power as possible. And both President Bush and President Obama did this. Now, the claim you can claim back on this is, well, but they have to demonstrate that there's a connection back to al-Qaeda in some way, because that's what the Authorization of Military Force Act did. It's not hard to claim that any group that's out there in the Middle East is somehow connected back to al-Qaeda. I mean, you name me the group, I will demonstrate to you that there is an indirect connection back to this. So basically, it hands over a massive amount of power to the executive branch. And that leads into one of the biggest controversies that's happened, and that is the use of drone warfare. Both the Afghani and the Iraqi war led to many more casualties than anybody expected that this was going to take place. And a big part of this has to do with the terrain. Central Asia is just so difficult to fight in due to the high mountains and high altitude. And so because of that, especially President Obama, but it goes back to President Bush as well, decided to try and scale back on the amount of troops that we were putting in and rather to use drone warfare because drones are just so much easier to use for access. And they leave a lighter military footprint on the ground. And there's actually a huge advantage of this, not just for American forces, but also for people on the ground who are on the opposite side. Drones tend to kill far less people overall than if we were to have military troops on the ground. However, there has been a disadvantage that has happened as well, that Bush and Obama both tried to hide. And the disadvantage is this: when you are having airplanes that are remotely controlled by people somewhere within the United States, firing missiles to the ground, it is almost impossible not to have collateral damage at some point. And this has meant an increased amount of civilian deaths during these attacks, creating a lot of backlash against the United States from other countries. Both Bush and Obama have claimed that the reason for them doing these kinds of things is national security. So here again, we see a weakening of the War Powers Act. And probably one of the biggest things then that has amped up this even more has been the Arab Spring. So back in 2009, there were a number of revolutions against authoritarian governments. Young Arabs started to rise up in a numerous amount of areas against theocrats and dictators, places like Tunisia, Iran, Egypt, and Syria. And many of these groups joined with smaller, more radical religious groups that wanted to see an end to secular, corrupt governments. It appeared that al-Qaeda was collapsing, especially with the fact that both President Bush and President Obama were able to cut the funding and eventually kill Osama bin Laden. However, as we know, this lasted for a very short period of time. Unfortunately, the Arab Spring turned into a much more violent type of religious rebellion than we originally imagined. A revolt took place in Syria against President Assad, and that was stalled in 2010. As both groups were fighting against each other and there was a stalemate between the two groups, a new radical religious group began to arise. It originally was al-Qaeda in Iraq, but this group renamed itself as ISIS. And ISIS went into Syria and saw an opportunity in Syria to start jumping ahead. Now, here's the funny part about this. ISIS is so brutal that al-Qaeda actually got rid of ISIS. They actually kicked them out of their organization. So in some ways, al-Qaeda ended up looking at this point like they were the moderate ones and ISIS was the more radical ones. ISIS wanted to establish and create a caliphate that would stretch from Syria all the way out to Iraq. And actually, their ideology is you cannot be a true Muslim unless you live within a caliphate and give your submission over to the leader of the caliphate, who would then be the sultan for Allah. They used the instability in Iraq following the Iraqi war and the corrupt leadership. The new leadership in Iraq after we left was a man named President Maliki, who is a Shiite, and he used his Shiite government to go after the Sunni minority and try to get rid of them so he could create more of a domination over the government. ISIS ended up making major gains back in 2010 in northern Iraq. He massacred Kurds and Christians in that area. Today, fortunately, ISIS has been cut back pretty dramatically. Within the last year, they've lost about 40% of their land, and it looks like very soon they're going to be limited down to only one city, and that is their capital, Raqqa. But what this demonstrates, again, is the context in which the executive branch has gotten more and more power in order to fight against these types of groups. So, under Obama, his military strategy seems to have been more of a multilateral effort. He wanted to end the war in Iraq and then focus on Afghanistan. And really what his hope was in the end was to turn all of our attention away from the Middle East and really pivot towards Southeast Asia and towards trade agreements with Southeast Asia. So the way he did this was to have a combined air attack with the United States with Arab coalitions on the ground. And he justified all of this not by Congress declaring war, but rather by saying that he had been given this power during the Bush administration through Congress's authorization of Military Force Act. So what are the takeaways we can take from this? The presidential powers really have grown over time, and not due to a literal definition of the Constitution, but rather due to the precedent of emergency powers. Another possibility might be due to the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution, as we've talked about during the year, led to the technocratic state and the need for management within the federal government. But probably the biggest reason why has been American leadership in the world post-World War II. So both the Cold War and now the War on Terror has really led to a need for management and leadership, well, that tends to be assumed by the president. And the way the president has done this is to assume power through the vagueness of emergency powers. And it really has not been helped by the fact that the Congress has basically given the president this power. Back when the Congress passed the Authorization of Military Force Act, basically what that ended up doing was it gave all these powers over to President Bush, and it's been assumed by President Obama, and I'm sure that President Trump is going to use that as well. Who wouldn't, if they are president, be able to use that kind of precedent in order to make sure that they can do what they believe has been given to them to lead the country. Now, the big question is, does this take us so far away from what the founders originally had wanted by trying to make war powers very difficult to do and spread out in the national debate? Or is this something we really need as far as flexibility goes with the executive branch?